dere skrudd på deres, eller det...
Ja.
Ok.
Ja, klar. Vi bare... Jeg tar av briller og slapper av.
Ja.
Hey. Good morning.
Hvis det er flere seter foran her også, det er alltid sånn de som kommer sist for de beste setene.
Er det vi som bestemmer når vi starter?
Hva?
Er det vi som bestemmer når vi starter?
Jeg tror det er du som bestemmer alt. Du er sjefen. Den er...
Ja,
du må ikke starte med en gang.
Nei, kan...
Dette er ekstremt presist.
Ja. Jeg tror det var bra at vi fikk opp den. Okay.
Ta den opp etter at
ja. Så hun kan ta den opp når vi kan ta neste spørsmål på en måte, når vi går videre. Forsvinner den.
Naturlig kaffepause.
Ja. Jeg glemte å hente kaffe. Ja.
Jeg tror det er ganske bra med folk. Så kommer de sigende på.
Det er veldig kult.
Vi er langt over skamgrensen. Det er nok du.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I think it's time to start. So good morning and welcome to this Breakfast for Democracy on military coups of today. My name is Lisa Marie Selvik and I'm a pilot of the Democracy in Law unit here at the Center on Law and Social Transformation. This event will be streamed and uploaded to the Bergen Global web pages. So you'll find it there and on Facebook and all of the other channels after the event. We also have the BFF Democracy hashtag, so feel free to use that as well. Today we're here to talk about military coups. Military coups has sort of this retro feel to it, we discussed, something belonging to the 60s and 70s. But still we see coups happening today as well. And as political scientists, we have this tendency, or this knack of maybe not looking far enough back in history. So that's what we will be doing today, and see if we can learn something about the different trends of coups that has been, and what they can tell us about how we should see coups of today. So with us today we have Henrik Knutsen from the University of Oslo. He's here to present a very new exciting global dataset on historic regime breakdowns, where coup is featuring as one of the most prominent ways that regimes die. We also have Lise Rakner from the University of Bergen to contribute with the more comparative aspects from Africa and other relevant coups cases. So I think before we actually start discussing the coups we see today, it's good to agree on what we're actually talking about. So what is actually a coup, Henrik? You're the expert here.
So it's always hard to start with a definition, but I think it's a good, it's a good chance, and then we can have a Q&A on different definitions as we go along. But to be serious, I think there are identifying exactly what coup is. When does a regime end through a coup, and when is it a popular revolution? When is it a self-coup? When is it something else? I think it's hard to draw up the boundaries, but there are a couple of things that need to be in place. The first is that coup is regarded as a non-constitutional or a kind of change of the leadership that is not according to the previous rules. So the rules that were in place on how to select leaders are violated when there is a coup d'etat. So this is not a regular transition of leadership for example, as in a monarchy, where according to the established rules, the power passes from the dead father to say the eldest son. And it's not like in a democracy where you have established rules for elections. So you're violating the rules, and at the same time, there's a need to distinguish it from popular revolutions, or revolutions, revolts, uprisings. So there's something about the number of actors that are engaged. So oftentimes you will look both at the identity of the actors. So typically in coups you have military officers engaged, but you can have other elite actors as well. But I think the more important thing is that there's a limited number of actors that are directly involved. So it's not like 1 million people out on the square. There are a few army units that occupy the, let's say, the main TV station and the presidential palace or whatever. So I think those non-constitutional and a few elite actors coordinating. That's key.
Thank you. Because what we grabbed the occasion of organizing this seminar on coups after the very recent attempted coup in Gabon. And I think this also begs the question. I mean, we also have discussed the less recent but still very interesting case of Zimbabwe in December 2017. And it begs the question, like, what is a coup today? And like, when do you know that a coup is actually a coup? And Lisa, I don't know, from the very varied different, we see different coups happening in Africa, whether it's, as Karl-Henrik says, like it's just a change of leadership, or if it's actually like a turnover of the politicians.
So would you allow me like 30 seconds of kind of information advertising just before? So I just wanted to say that this Breakfast for Democracy is organized by the research project called Breaking Bad, Understanding Backlash Against Democracy in Africa, where Lisa Maria is a PhD student. The reason why I'm shamelessly advertising this is, of course, that this is where both Karl-Henrik and I belong, because Karl-Henrik we're lucky to have Karl-Henrik on our advisory board. So that's another reason why I'm really grateful that you're here today. So those are my 30 seconds. Then back to your question. It's really fascinating. Yesterday I was going to meet Karl-Henrik and Lisa Maria at Pingvin. And then I walked past Bulia, you know, that fancy furniture shop. And I saw a cord, sort of a code flail. I don't know what the English word is. You know, these like super 70s sofa beds. And like I remember having in the 70s, and it's coming back into fashion. And I was thinking this sort of retro thinking. Now we're back to thinking about coups. And wasn't that something we kind of left behind in the 70s? So that was like, wow, is this coming back? So it's true we don't have that many coups. In 2018, I don't think there was a single coup in the world. But in 2013, 2014, there were like 12 non-successful coups. Most of them in Africa. And then we had the Zimbabwean case, which is not a coup. It is a military-assisted transition. That was very important for General Moyo when he went on, as you said, go on TV. Why is that so important? So a military-assisted transition. That sounds like a euphemism for a coup, and it is. But the point is, it's super important not to be labeled a coup. Because if you're labeled a coup, the big change since 2000 is that the African Union had changed, the constitution changed from the Organization of African Unity, and they have zero tolerance on coups, you know, on military leaders upsetting the constitutional process to gain power. So obviously, being labeled a coup is something you really would like to avoid. So they went on TV, they said it's not a coup, it's a military-assisted transition. And then they immediately promised new elections. I think that's another kind of important difference between sort of contemporary successful or non-successful, whatever, coups and the old ones. A military taking power today cannot last for more than maximum 10 months. They have to promise an election within a year. Of course, then in the election, they can either win, you know, they have... make sure that they control the elections, control the parties, control who the new candidates are. But to have a kind of an indefinite military rule, that is not in the books anymore. So I think that's one of the biggest differences. Then I also thought about another difference that and this comes back to what just happened in Zimbabwe. Because things haven't gone superbly well since the November 2017 military-assisted transition. There's been a lot of uprising, and the economy is going downwards to a level it's impossible to even comprehend. But now protests, how do you control this? The president went to Russia to, strike some deals, and then we had huge protests in the street. What is the sort of gut reaction of the number 2 in charge, who is a military commander? He goes back to his sort of military thinking. This time, they crush down, people are killed in the streets, tanks are back in the streets, but this time that he doesn't go on TV. What he does is that they shut down internet for 4 days. The entire internet is shut down. Now, this is contemporary. This is, going to a TV station or shutting down a TV station or controlling a TV station is not going to help much in the age of WhatsApp and social media. The real contemporary sort of autocratic tool for coup makers is to control the internet. And they actually managed to close down the internet for 4 or 5 days, which is very, very, crucial. Because in that period, we're now learning a lot of things happened. Back to the Gabon case, and we can talk more about that because you know quite a bit about that. That seemed like kind of it's not a classic. It's an election gone bad. It is a family, the Bongo family, who's been in power forever, and they fix transitions within the family. And then clearly the 2016 elections showed that the people really wanted a change, but that didn't happen. And so there's a lot of sort of animosity stemming from elections, which I think is... But this coup seemed very, what can I say, sort of... I think what's clear from this coup attempt is that I don't think the junior officers who attempted this coup actually had a plan to rule. I think the plan was to disrupt and to sort of signal that this regime is not as strong as you think. I don't think they actually had a plan to rule. So to what extent it was a failed coup or a signal that, your days are counted, I think we could discuss.
Mm. I think what you're drawing up here has so many interesting dimensions of how we can actually think about how about coups used to be and how they are more today. The role of military and also the role that we expect the military to actually play in what we could call more democratic regimes or hybrid regimes, more insecurity regimes. And I think Karl-Henrik's study also, you're looking at the level of democracy as one of the factors, but I think we really want to get a more sense of your study because you're looking at both the level of the economy and the level of democracy, and you're looking at these different determinants that changes over time in history.
Right. So I can just start by saying something about the data. So this is, we label it the historical regimes data. It's actually part of a larger enterprise, which is some of you might know, which is called the Varieties of Democracy dataset, VDEM dataset. So this is actually these regimes data that we've collected, both by using research assistants and then new questions to the VDEM country experts on which are the supporting groups propping up the regime in power, be it a democratic one or an autocratic one. These are new data that were released with last year's VDEM for the time period 1789 to 1920, and now it's going all the way forward to 2017 with the new data release. So these are going to go public in about a month. And as you can see from the cool and non-monotonic lines here, so they're both going up and going down. There are interesting, so these lines are basically particular ways that regimes die. So these are all the polities of the world that are part of the VDEM dataset. And we're looking then at regimes which we define as the formal and informal rules for selecting leaders. So when there's a clear break or a big change in these rules, for example, when you go from a military regime to a democracy, we say that there's a regime change. The old regime breaks down, in this instance, from a military regime to a democratic one. It could be a governed transition to democracy. So it could be something that the incumbents are part of in transitioning the regimes. It could be a popular uprising. So there are different ways that regimes can transition. And coups is then one particular version of such a regime change. And the green, unfortunately, it's not very easy to spot, but the green line over here basically shows you the frequency of coups. And this, the retro feel to it discussion of coup d'etats is pretty much highlighted here in this last peak, which is around 1960, and then you can see the downward slope here on the green line. I hope you can see it at least. So this is basically the fall of coups, and we are not the first one to discuss this, because basically there has been data on coups from the 1950s out there for quite a while. So the story has been one of the decline of coups, but what is interesting, and of course those of you who have read history, in particular Latin American history, would know that coups was not a new phenomenon in the 1960s. It was also quite big in the mid-19th century. So you can see a peak here around, right behind Lisa, around 1850. And then you can see by the year 1900, it was quite rare as opposed to in the 1850s. So there have been these cycles before. So this is interesting. What are the factors that tend to generate this clustering of coups in time? And I think we've been talking about some international norms, international actors. There's something about how actors or how coup plotters in one country learn from what is happening in the neighboring country. So there are these different international dynamics that contribute to this clustering. But there are other factors as well, and I think Lisa touched on one of them, and that relates to the importance of controlling information. So from a a priori, theoretical point of view, I would guess it's harder today to plot a successful coup than it was 30, 40 years ago. Basically because 30, 40 years ago, I would know that I'd have to go and take the main radio channel and main TV channel of the country in order to control the information flow. And why is it so important to control the information flow? And I think this speaks to a more general point about coups and any type of regime change, is the importance of being able to coordinate with your allies or your potential allies, and making sure that those that are on the other side are not able to coordinate. So if you can strike in the middle of the night and the other potential opponents are not able to talk to each other and coordinate, then you sit much safer than if they're able to use the internet, use WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever to basically talk together and arrange how to meet up and organize a resistance. So this is why shutting down the internet is so important. Then again, this is harder today than it was basically a few decades ago, controlling just the TV station. So I think that contributes to this decline of coups. It's not impossible to organize a coup, but it's harder. So that's one factor.
Mm. Yeah, because I guess that's if you want to plot a coup, I guess there are two questions. So like, when do you do it, and how do you do it? So I guess, for instance, in the Gabon case we have been discussing, I mean, these were junior officers in the army, right? They weren't really, I mean, they were presented as if nobodies, you know, they didn't know, like, it wasn't clear which alliances they had.
Right.
So yeah.
So and this speaks to the entire coordination problem, right? So think about living under the Bongo regime. It's probably quite.
Are you okay with the screen going up?
I'm okay with the screen.
Yes.
Going up.
Okay. So now you're gonna.
The data are.
The data is now disappearing, and then aesthetics are taking over.
Yeah. There are books. Probably a couple of coups described in these books. So I think it speaks to the importance of coordination. Right, so it's hard when you're then under the former regime to know exactly who your allies are. So these junior officers probably lived in the barracks. They talked amongst each other, had a couple of friends, but it was really hard to know who were against the regime. Of course, being vocally against the regime that is autocratic can be quite dangerous. So people are probably not speaking up, at least not all the ones that are dissatisfied. So it's hard to know who your allies are. And it's also hard then to know to be able to make specific plans on exactly how to organize things after the transition has taken place. So basically going out there and saying, well, we need allies, now we're going to figure it out, that's basically a part of the plan. Very few coups have very detailed plans going forward on exactly whom to cooperate with and how to do things. And that's basically part of the difficulty of coordinating and talking together, which I think is so important.
And another challenge with the information, you say, as before it was so easy to go and take the radio station, then you control the narrative. You could frame the coup, like you can keep a lid on it. You could, give the people just the information you wanted. But now with social media and internet, it's easier as well for maybe nobodies or like junior officers to also maybe shape the narrative. I mean, and this is about the pretexts of coups, right? I mean, just reading. Just a very simple example of this is how, of course, the government will call them rebels, but by the people they were known as soldiers. Soldiers are, yes, they were junior officers, but they were still regarded as a legitimate part of the army. Well, the government went out and called them rebels, right?
I was just thinking back to your coup definition about this, that it has to be, you distinguish it from a revolution by saying that there's a kind of a contained it's the smallness in number, but also the elite status. So it's not. So, so I think what is really also really interesting. I'd like to, maybe sort of find out more from your data set. Is that how, when we think about a military, there are factions, but there are like three branches controlling force. It's police, it's the intelligence, and it's the military, right? And then you have ranks within. But so I think this sort of collaboration between those three units, police, intelligence, and army, how that sort of plays out is also very important. In the Zimbabwean case, it was quite clear that this coup was sort of staged from the army side that had really close ties into the party. Whereas much less clear where the police was at this point, and the intelligence was. That was a question that we didn't really know about. So I think that's also I don't know really. I really don't know how what we know in this sort of globally. This sort of how these factions play out. But it's clear that it's about an elite. But does it matter whether this elite is from the military faction, the intelligence, or the police?
So there's this whole literature on coup proofing. It's a fabulous concept. So how do you proof against coups? You're a sitting leader and you want to make sure that you remain in power as long as possible. And coups is one of the main dangers. And one of the first things you will read when looking up basically the playbook on how to avoid a coup is how to create new security factions. Create your own presidential guard. Police force is pretty often quite loyal. The army is difficult because it has two basic functions. So mainly the main function is to protect the country from outside threats. And that, of course, makes the army a little bit of a different beast than the other ones, which can be designed just to control forces within potential opposition. So the army is often used for that purpose as well. But the fact that it has a different function makes the army potentially a haven for opposition figures or people who think differently. So I think the classic, without having the exact data here, but I think the typical pattern is to underfund the army and basically build up your own security apparatus as a parallel. So there are also studies showing that this weakens the fighting force of the country if there comes to an international war. But it can be a super rational strategy for a leader who is anxious that one of these branches are going to take control. So I think that's a key point.
We also know that armies are quite like conservative actors, right? That they don't like change. So also for instance, in this newer context, I mean, what the role that we expect armies to have and like their own perception of their own role. Do you think that has changed as well over the time?
So one thing that's important for anyone that wants to rule, and especially the army, which is not, it's basically not constructed for ruling a country. That's not its main original function. So that may not be where its expertise is. Which basically means that you need a lot of support. You need things to go well. You need popular support. So not people, you don't have people like basically slow walking and refusing to do their jobs. And avoiding international sanctions, I think, is key. And this is something that Lisa talked about with the African Union. I think it's very important to understand this downward trend. Perhaps more important than the internet TV distinction is the change in norms, international norms. So coup is a very clear violation of democratic norms. Of course, democracy is not taking root in all countries in the world, and there are different ways to violate it. But coups is a very obvious violation. And that's why I think it's so easy for the OAS or the African Union to write up very clear paragraphs condemning coups. So that makes it hard. So the reason I'm going this this route is basically relates to the question of how to rule, right? Or so what was the original formulation? Yeah.
Oh, the role of the military, what we expect them to do.
Yeah. So I think right now, I mean, if everything was easy and simple, and the population had supported the army and they had a clear mandate, there were no international sanctions, then maybe they could have set up a system to rule for some period of time. But what you typically see is that military regimes, and especially today, are more short-lived than other regimes. And that's basically related to this expectation, I think, that you guys are not experts in ruling. This is not legitimate. It's at best a transitional thing. So maybe you came in to remove a corrupt president. Maybe you came in to restore elections. Then we need to have a plan in place, and we need to make sure that we have a transition towards the democratic regime. And I think that's a function of both the international norms that are in place today, the international institutions that are sanctioning military regimes often. So I think that's often the expectation, that it's a transitional regime. That was a long-winded answer to a very simple question.
No,
Sorry about that.
It's perfect. You also had some.
So I was just thinking, if you back to the graph that's in our heads now and not in our screen. I would suspect that, especially from the 1950s onwards, what's driving your data is the African continent. Obviously, because of its size, the 50 countries, post-colonialism, and this was the coup continent of the 60s and 70s. But there are when you look into the more detail, you see that there are regions in Africa that sort of drives the data, and that is West Africa, Central and West Africa. And I think, and I want to get back to this because this is something about the norms, because ECOWAS, the sort of kind of what is the Central Union or kind of regional union for West Africa, has historically been much less, much more lenient towards coup and coup plotters and military takeovers than anywhere else. This goes back to show how these regional and global norms become very important. It's only recently that sort of AU norms have kind of surpassed ECOWAS' own set of rules. So this is why this is kind of a Central Western Africa phenomenon. And you've had very few coups, for instance, in Southern Africa, which makes this case of Zimbabwe kind of interesting. So this is my way of responding to your question. I think that contemporary military leaders are different in the sense that they are much more merged with the kind of civilian politics. In this case of Zimbabwe, what has really happened since 2000, since the land grabs and the land transitions and what have you, and all, is that you've seen an incredible merge of the ZANU PF party, the military, and business. So these, especially ownership of small-scale mining. So there's a complete kind of fusion in the leadership from these three branches, business, mines, government, or party and military. And that is just, it's a lot more difficult to sort of disentangle and to say, when is Moyo a civilian leader, when is he a general? He's both, but he clearly behaves as a general in government. But it's sort of okay within the rules, right? But I think this merger is something relatively new, and it's much more difficult to sort of, it's more difficult to plot in data sets, but it's also much more difficult to know how to handle sort of politically from a, from a point of view of, sort of external actors and democracy, from a democracy perspective.
And picking up on what you said, I mean, some countries we do see more coups in Western Africa, and some countries have had more coups than others, right? So, and we talked about this yesterday as well. Like, I mean, when do military leaders coup? Like, when is it a good time to coup, and why is it maybe so that some countries have more coups than others?
Yeah. So this is if you do statistical analysis of what determines a coup, and you run. You have different countries and you have long time series. You can see that the coup history variable, which is basically capturing your history of past coups, is always one of the most clearly relevant for predicting coups. So basically, there's something about history there, and I think that could pick up a lot of things. So it could basically pick up that you have particular actors within the military, that you have a particularly troublesome political climate that makes it. In some cases, you have a gridlock between politicians and military leaders say enough is enough. Now we go in and we just basically wipe out the playing field and we start all over again. And then there's learning from history, I guess. Maybe you had a successful general that made a coup that didn't really that turned out to not be as grave as you might fear. Maybe it installed successful elections, and then you look back to that as. In order to learn. But in addition to these more historical and between country things, I think there are, at least from the statistical literature on coups, there are a couple of things that we can learn. And one goes back to the coordination issue. Again, I think this is the key theoretical point for understanding coups. So what is it that allow coup plotters to coordinate? And how do you basically stop others from coordinating? And I think this is the same for coups as for uprisings. And I think you need some kind of clear signal that now is the time to react. Now is the time to be frustrated and remove the regime. And I think economic crisis is so sudden drops in GDP per capita, sudden cuts to the public budget, especially if it's military spending, I guess, then it's... that's a very clear signal for different actors within the military to coordinate. So anything that is sudden and that induces grievances, so people are frustrated, are really dangerous, and economic crisis is one such thing. The other thing is basically election losses for the incumbent. So you have a president that. Well, you know that this guy is probably manipulating elections, or most certainly is manipulating elections. But still, I mean, if the president falls from 70% to 55% in the last elections, you know that he's really unpopular. I mean, even with all the manipulation, 55% is a really low vote total. So maybe it's truly 20%. This is a clear event that marks. That also marks that people are frustrated with the current regime. So elections where the incumbent performs really poorly is also clearly predicting coups. So the military officers then know that now is the time to react, now is the time to coordinate against an unpopular leader.
And does this resonate with what we see?
I think it definitely does, but this also reminds me, before this data set that I'm really excited about, and it's coming out in a month, and your work, the data set that I was more familiar with on coups was from University of Florida, Powell. This just occurred to me that they say that exactly what you said, that history is a great predictor. There's all this debate, what is coup? What happens with coups? Does coup really does it kill democracies? It's like the road to autocracy. Does it provide an opening for, maybe, as you said, for change, as maybe in the case of Gabon, it could have been a change to the Bongo family. But I think that, so, I kind of want to hear what you say about that. These people, they were the University of Florida people, Powell and his colleagues. They say that coups are just really a predictor of what happened before. So, a coup really sort of changes the regime to what was. If the regime before the military was an autocracy, then what comes after is an autocracy. So in a sense, kind of very populistically, and that basically says that coups doesn't really change anything. And I kind of wondered if your data set would say something differently. So this is me peeking into.
Yeah. So that's actually a question that we haven't looked into, the potentially democratizing or autocratizing roles of coups. So what we do is we flip it and we look at where you are on the democracy scale, whether or not that predicts the probability of a coup. And we basically find the same thing that previous studies have found on shorter time series, that the most unstable regimes in general are the ones in the middle. Those that don't score particularly high on in terms of democracy, and those that are not very autocratic either, but those that are semi-something. I mean, there's a whole debate on how to label these regimes. I'm not going to go into that, but let's call them semi-democracies. And those are the ones where you see the coups the most often. So when it comes to the other way around, so does coups really change anything? I think the key observation is that any regime breakdown in a poor country that is an autocracy, it is more likely to be the replacing regime is more likely to be an autocratic regime, no matter which kind of process you're having. But once in a while there's a change to a more democratic setting, and oftentimes these democracies turn fairly stable. So we haven't really looked into that. I've seen some different results based on other data on the potentially, when are coups potentially democratizing. So when you have these long these autocracies with a long history, and particularly if it happens in not too poor countries, then having a coup can predict democracy 5 years down the road. But again, it's very uncertain. I mean, basically you can have all kinds of different regime forms coming after a coup. So it's hard to predict.
It's as you mentioned. It's when you have a coup, you're rustling up the very set power structures of a place or of an entity. Maybe or maybe not at all. But also, if we're talking about these like internal power structures that we can't really see, I mean, different entities can have very different. The military can have a very different place within the state, right? And you mentioned. One of you mentioned also like this potential threat of a coup can maybe have an effect as well. I mean, you don't really have to coup as long as people remember that, this has happened before. We have if you have a history of coup maybe, or if just the military is able to. Do you think that has an effect, Lisa, like the threat of a coup?
So I'm sort of going to look at the audience for this one, and maybe even Svenny. Svenny, I'm kind of waiting for your question on this one. No, I'm thinking about the Gabon case. That to what extent this actually was a coup, or was kind of a serious attempt to transition or to take power, or maybe it was sort of a signal that there are clear limits to this regime's longevity. And so in my sense, what are the chances of 5 junior officers actually really having, unless they are like really sort of they have different perceptions of themselves in their heads. But what are the chances realistically of 5 junior officers sort of taking over a country and change? So my sense is that maybe that was not the plan. And the plan was more to signal the weakness of the regime, and that there are clear limits. I'd love to hear other people's views on this one, because these are just my speculations.
And I think it's actually time to open up for questions from the audience. So they will actually, because there's so many here, we want to hear all of the questions. So yeah, is there anyone who has something burning? Otherwise, I have more questions.
I put you on the spot, Sonia.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have to use the mic or not.
We have we have a catch box, a new invention at the center.
Catch? Oh,
and then you can throw
oh my
it
God,
around.
this is so innovative.
All right, thanks. I have numerous questions. This was really interesting, of course. I'll actually not address the one that you threw at me, so someone else will have to do that. But I'm just wondering, just in terms of changes over time, because this is really interesting. But one of the things that, I mean, in our project, I'm part of the same research project as you, of course. So it's no surprise.
So we're all part of the same project.
Yes.
More advertising.
But I'm just wondering, so what has changed more recently in terms of the role that the military is playing that combines the two things that you're talking about? So Lisa is saying that the military is more involved in politics and they're more ingrained in the elite, and at the same time they're not overly enthusiastic about coups anymore, at least not being formally associated with a coup. So I'm thinking about the change of the security situation and the security narrative internationally, particularly after 9/11 and the emerging terrorism narrative. And I'm just wondering if this kind of change has brought the military back as a formal or at least a more powerful player in politics, but at the same time that now it's more playing out its role as a conservative force of protecting the common good and national security in a sense. So if this could be a potential explanation for kind of changing this somewhat confusing or perhaps conflicting trends. And piggybacking on that, and with regards to the Zimbabwean case as well, I'm just wondering, you talked about the kind of the importance of economic indicators, Karl-Henrik, but I would also like to challenge you, perhaps both of you, on the importance of the particular economic interests of the military and security actors, because you see in a lot of the countries where the military are playing an important role, not just in Africa, but in places like Thailand, which is arguably one of the few existing military dictatorships of today, they have really powerful economic interests and have had for quite a while. So they have a pretty strong incentive for actually intervening in politics to protect those economic interests. So I have more questions as well, but I have...
But we have another question from Becky. And sorry.
So can I throw it? Or?
Okay. You can
Okay.
actually throw it. It's like this is wow. We can have so much fun with this.
Oh, thanks so much. My question is on because I think now you're focusing on the internal dynamics that lead to a coup, but I want you to also touch on the international ones, because I think the international forces are so much important in determining whether there will be a coup. I want to address what you were talking about, Lisa, on junior officers attempting a coup. I think there was a successful case in the case of the Gambia, which first it was seen as just a mutiny of junior officers, but they succeeded in '94, and they were able to lead for a very long time. So I think even in Gabon, it could have been possible that these junior officers could have achieved the coup and be able to actually lead the country for a few more years. Yeah, thanks.
Great.
Should we take a round on that and then let the...
I have a really short attention, sort of memory span, so it would be great if we could.
Yeah, so I'll just second the last comment on the failed coup in Gabon. I think it looks very silly when it falls apart, and about half or even more, according to the Palatine data, they fall apart. But I think what you're hoping for is the spiraling dynamics, right? That some big shot comes to your aid and says, well, we're supporting this uprising. So it could have gone a different route, although I'm sure that people tend to overestimate their own own abilities. So yeah, as regards to the conflicting trends, I think the first thing to point out is that the military plays a very different role in different countries, right? So you have those countries, so not only in Zimbabwe or in Thailand, but say countries such as Pakistan, where the army obviously has great ownership interests in a lot of different businesses. Egypt as well. So I mean, trying to take away someone's privilege is the most. That's the best way of pissing people off, right? so trying to reform an economy where the army has a big ownership is certainly something that's going to antagonize the army. So I think touching their core interests, that would be one way to secure intervention. And I think this speaks to the point that you were touching on earlier on. So what is it? God, there's no time difference from Oslo. Maybe I haven't had enough coffee. Right. So it speaks to. I simply forgot what I was supposed to say. This is my Alzheimer's moment. So yeah, back to the war on terror and the international funding. It also touches on the second comment, the role of international factors. And I think this gives a pretext, at least it gives a potential legitimation for the army to intervene in politics if there's a terrorist threat. I think legitimation strategies are important. At the same time, I think there's also something about old excuses wearing thin. Same thing about taking out corrupt leaders, fighting terrorism. It's often easy to look beyond that, and I do think it's hard to maintain harder to maintain military rule today than it was earlier. Even if this the potential funding and the legitimation of the terrorist threat is something that's pulling perhaps in the opposite direction. So there are probably different forces here, and that's a counter current. But I still think it's harder, even with that change.
So I was just thinking, in a sense, Becky, to combine your question to Karl-Henrik and mine, because I think, in a sense, 1994 in the Gambia and 2019 in Gabon, there is, maybe that time difference. Those 25 years, that may be an indicator in terms of the international environment for military rule. And I think that there are a lot of changes. I mean, if you look at the changes within the sort of regional norms, not least within ECOWAS and the relationship between ECOWAS and AU, there may be some explanations there. And so I was thinking, maybe this is a new research piece. Combine, actually looking at, because I think it's actually a great question, because there are so many similarities in terms of the coup makers, but there is a 25-year time gap, and so that sort of. And I'm wondering to what extent these sort of regional and external variables play in. But apart from that, I totally agree. You hope for a momentum, and maybe you have it, and maybe you don't. And there are thousands of small variables that may change that. I think back to just not to repeat myself. But I think your point about the economic interests of the military or military leaders are extremely important, and I think to what extent they are threatened by what's happening in the regime, as in the case of Zimbabwe, which was it was really sort of a factional fight within the ZANU-PF, and the military saw their personal economic interests threatened by the what was called the Gucci faction, and they saw their economic interests protected by and that's, so I think you're right. There's that. Those sort of personal economic interests played a huge role. I think that's a very, very good, well spotted.
Looking at the intersections of military and how it intertwines with the rest of the state and market forces. Any more questions? I don't know where the ball went. There's a question at the bottom there.
I wish I would throw the ball because it looks so fun.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of what I'm going to ask, and I've have some potential comments, but just a simple question to begin with. You didn't talk that much about the role of parties and their links to militaries as a term of coup proofing, which is an historical example in some cases, and also you didn't really talk about how ideology is a motivational factor for people to actually want to take power, like commit a coup in a couple of countries. It's been historically, for instance, in Libya with Gaddafi 50 years ago, or to some extent Nasser and his group in 52 in Egypt. Because that's important with the end of the Cold War, how external actors are important, but also how that affects internal motivation in regards of actually the people who commit coups. So you could touch on that for a bit. It's not that relevant, but it's kind of interesting.
It's both interesting and highly relevant, I think.
Is there one more? Did I see a hand? Yes, in the front here.
Throw the ball.
Yes. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. I just have a question about the frequency of coups. So in your data, you had successful coups that led to regime change. And I guess there are as many of those that are unsuccessful that were, like in Gabon, tried but did not succeed. And I was wondering about coups that happen that do not lead to regime change. So I'm thinking, for example, about Greece between 1967 and 1974, or maybe Soviet Union, the removal of Khrushchev from power. So coups that were successful but did not lead to regime change, and how many of these there are. And it also links to this point that you made earlier that coups are changes of regime that are not in compliance with existing rules for changing leadership and power. And maybe some authoritarian regimes just don't have any established institutionalized rules how to replace incumbent leaders. And maybe in some regimes, coups are actually a way to replace leaders. Or, I mean, it's not my field of expertise. So I'm just a question out of curiosity. Yes, thank you.
Can I just follow up on that? Because that links to a question I was having. So how do you, in the dataset, how do you code unsuccessful coups? No, because that is, of course, super difficult. That's what I was wondering, how you would code them. But if you don't, that's okay. I was just thinking, I just kept thinking about Malawi a few years back, when sort of the brother to the president, when Bingu Mutharika died, there was this sort of phase where he was trying to take over, and then eventually he didn't manage. But so I mean, according to your definition, it would be a coup attempt, but it didn't happen. But that would of course. So in a way, it would be really, really interesting to see whether unsuccessful coups are as much on the decline, or if it's just more difficult to do coups. Because that you said something earlier, that it is more difficult because it's more difficult to control information. There are things that make it more difficult. But so the best way to know about that would, of course, be to also try and see the ratio of unsuccessful and successful.
So I can try to address these last questions. So just to clarify, our data was a regime's data set originally. So which is why we didn't code the unsuccessful coups. But I agree, if you are to really dig into the determinants of coups, I think the separation between coup attempt and what makes a coup successful is really important. And the data that Lisa mentioned from Powell and Tyne do count unsuccessful and successful coups. So there's this very fascinating study that just came out from a young scholar named Roman Olar, which looks at the predictors of coups and coup attempts, and conditional on that, what predicts coup success. And I think one of the takeaways from that study is that it's so damn hard to predict coup success once you know that there's been a coup attempt. So which ones of these coups are succeeding and which ones are not is really hard to predict based on structural factors such as GDP, democracy level, these things. And that basically speaks to some of the things that we've talked about, I think, about events just taking their own turns. And there are a couple of other interesting stories there as well on exactly when do you try to coup a weak regime versus a strong regime, and only the strongest coup plotters would be brave enough to go up against strong regimes, etc. So it's a hard, tricky game and puzzle to solve. But I fully agree that these coup attempts are interesting. If you really want to analyze coups and what makes them tick, I think you need to have those data as well.
You want to have a go at the ideology?
Ideology point, yeah.
So I'm going don't get left with that question on my own.
Yeah, okay. No, I think especially if you go some decades back and the role of containing communism, I think that for many military organizations, I think that was for many generals, I think that was a key motivation, in addition to other things. I think now maybe in several Muslim countries, I think it would be curbing extreme Islam would be like play a similar role for some military organizations in the Middle East and other places. But there's one thing about ideology that's hard. Of course, every ruler or prospective ruler needs to try to legitimate why you're taking power. So playing up an ideological enemy or coming up with your own program is required. I'm always left wondering to what extent that is real, right? Like, is this the real motivation, or is there something else to it? And I think Gaddafi is maybe a good case in point there, because I mean, the ideological branding of Gaddafi changed quite a lot during his tenure. So I think he's often interpreted as kind of a chameleon in the sense that he took on different ideologies. But of course, it's hard to say what originally motivated him. Yeah.
Which is related to the original motivation that the opposition towards monarchy as the starting point in '69, and then the changes in the subsequent decades.
Yeah. So I think my point would be that it's hard to say the extent to which that is a true motivation, or that is something you say in order to ease the transition. Right? It would be stupid not to say it. It would be stupid not to invoke an ideological motivation for your actions. And of course it's hard, right? So it's the issue of do you actually know whether or not he's speaking the truth or not?
I think that's sort of, there's a link between Magnus's and Siri's question. These are, this sort of post-rationalization, whether it's a successful or an unsuccessful coup, what motivated it? How, to actually sort of get to that and, from sort of credible angle, it's really hard, because obviously ideology would be an argument played. In the Egyptian case, it may as well be the answer may as well be the economic interests of the military. Obviously, seeing this more radical Islamic regime taking over and fearing their own economic interests. So that's how it's really hard to actually sort of define, have a sort of post rationalize around that, which is again, I think, serious question about when. How do you categorize a failed coup? So you brought up a case that's not even in the failed coup data. But that's interesting, because this was kind of a threat. There was a clear discussion. We know from the data that that was a discussion. Unless they follow the kind of the constitutional route, the military did actually, that was part of the discussion. But in the data on failed coups, if my sort of 2-hour research last night is any value, that doesn't even come in, because that's coups that are actually really sort of where they've actually gone out of the barracks and onto the streets, but they have not succeeded.
Can I just, because it doesn't have to involve the military, right?
No.
Right.
No.
So, no. But that's the question, because that is also how do you categorize a coup if it's a failed coup? Does it have to involve the military?
Right. So I can just mention that in our data we have 2 different categories. So we have military coups and coups by other elites.
Yeah.
So that would be like the royal family, the palace coups of older days. So those were actually,
This would be a palace coup.
yeah. But so these were merged in the graph that I just showed you. But the largest number is by far military coups, but there are others as well.
Yes, we have time for a short wrapping up. Actually, we have to wrap up. Time is flying too fast. So yeah, I just want to thank you for coming here, and I hope you saw on the Facebook page we posted the VDEM working paper that you've written, if you want to read more about the overall historic regime dataset. As we mentioned introductory, I mean, this Breakfast for Democracy is a breakfast series that we're doing here at the Center on Law and Social Transformation. It's coming out from the Breaking Bad, Understanding the Backlash Against Democracy project in collaboration with Bergen Global. And yes, we'll have a streaming online that you can watch soon. I want to thank you for coming out on behalf of the Center on Law and Social Transformation. So thank you so much for your coming out to Bergen.
Thank you.
And thank you. Yeah.
More coffee.
More coffee.
More coffee. That's the Democracy in Law cup. Yes. And thank you so much, Rolf, for coming. We wish you a great day onwards.
And thanks for having us.
Ja. Det vakker, altså. Det der kunst. Dette kunst.
Ja, det setter jeg på det. Dette jo boer. Dette den her lån democracy.
Ja.
Så den må du ha med deg.
Men var den grønn for noen år siden?
Ja, det var mange.
Ja, fordi jeg har en grønn.
Hvert ene tar sin egen kopp. Dette democracy.
Ikke bedre lån inn i quality-gruppen.
Ja.
Nei, han må komme tilbake for å få det. You have to earn it.
Så du kan bare komme tilbake.
Jeg tror jeg er 2.
Ja, men du skjønner, Leo har 4. Leo Ariola har 4. Og det målet hans å komme for å få 1 for alle. Han skal ha alle.
Da kommer 2
Så
nye
når du
til
kommer
sammen.
hjem til han i California, så det sånn, so now I have 4, and next time I'm getting my 5th cup. Det liksom den store insentive for å komme tilbake. Han har vært på 4.